Okay, hello everyone. My name is Rami Kaplan. I'm from Tel Aviv University. Thank you very much for attending the keynote session, which concludes this highly stimulating and thrilling Changing Climates conference. Before I introduce the speaker, some information about the framework of the session. Following my short introduction, Professor Rees will speak for 30 to 40 minutes. Then we have another 30 minutes for Q&A. Questions will be taken through the chat of the Zoom meeting. That means that you, the audience, write your question in the chat, and I will later collect and transmit them to Professor Rees. Please try to ask short questions rather than long ones, and I'd be grateful if you could write them in English. If it's a problem, all is well. Ask in Hebrew, and we will handle the translation. After the session, we will flow directly to some concluding remarks, generally for the conference by Dr. Avner Vishnitzer. One more thing that Professor Rees asked me to tell you, that he will make available his slideshow, so you don't need to write anything or so. Okay, so I will now I will start the introduction. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, William E. Rees, Professor Emeritus and former Director of the School of Community and Regional Planning at University of British Columbia. A pioneering human ecologist and ecological economist, Professor Rees has authored more than 150 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters and numerous popular articles on humanity's environmental conundrum. His 1996 book, Our Ecological Footprint, Reducing Human Impact on the Earth, where he and his student Matthias Wackernagel developed the groundbreaking notion of eco-footprinting, has been translated into 8 languages. Rees is a founding member and former president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics, a founding director of the One Earth Initiative, and a member of the Royal Society of Canada, the Post-Carbon Institute, and the Club of Rome. In addition, Rees has served on many advisory committees and given invited lectures in dozens of countries. The list of achievements goes on and on, but I'd like to use the next 3 minutes to say something in plain words on the substance of our guest's intellectual work. One main project that must be mentioned is ecological footprint analysis. Rees's most famous innovation, which is an approach to measuring the area of productive ecosystems required to sustain a human population or economic activity. It's easy to understand why this has become a pivotal approach for comprehending our problematic relationship with the planet and what to do about it. Footprint analysis indicates that in order to sustain human civilization to the levels of Western consumption, we would need 5 planets like Earth. It is astonishing then that the globally dominant sustainable development agenda, which is advanced by economic elites and embraced by the United Nations and most governments, is still pointing precisely in that radically unsustainable direction. Second, and related to the first point, Professor Rees has been a leading developer and spokesperson for the discipline of ecological economics, which, unlike mainstream neoclassical economics, acknowledges the biophysical constraints on economic activity. Much of Rees's ecological economics focuses on the implications of the transition to a sustainable civilization. Such a transition is obviously a tremendously complex issue, and Rees is among the few who have the scope of knowledge and analytical skills required to break down this issue into clear, tractable assessments and policy implication. Take the shift that everybody has been talking about, for example, from an economy based on fossil fuels to net zero emissions by mid-century. Is that even possible considering the acres of suitable land, tonnage of steel and concrete, and units of energy required to put the average wind turbine or solar panel to work? And what about the finite lifespan of these devices and the need for periodic replacement? And how many turbines and panels do we need in order to meet global energy demand, considering a unit's electricity output and the storage capacities available? Few have addressed these problems as authoritatively as Rees, problems which are obviously fundamental for any thinking about sustainable transition. Finally, considering that sound economic analysis suggests that environmental reform is without compare the most enormous challenge ever faced by humanity. A more recent thrust in Rees's work has been to reflect on the gap between the projected apocalyptic implications of the crisis and humanity's failure so far, not only to address the challenge, but even to be sincere about what is implied and involved in addressing it. Here, in combining the best of ecological economic analysis with sociological, psychological, and philosophical insights about the condition of our species, and particularly humanity's apparently amazing ability to blind itself to the problem, Rees builds very long bridges between the natural, social, and human sciences, and the result is often no less than mind-blowing. This is indeed perfect inspiration for a conference like this one, which seeks to encourage cross-disciplinary research and discussion of the crisis, and in turn to help raise public and decision makers' awareness and action to confront this defining challenge of our times. Thank you for being here. Bill, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very elaborate introduction. Do we have time for questions? Or are we going to? I don't think I've ever received as informed an introduction in my life as that, so I appreciate that very much. And I'd like to welcome all participants to this session. I understand it's quite late in the day there and everyone is tired. I hope I'm entertaining enough at least to keep you awake. So welcome all. I'm honored to be in your presence, and I think you will probably enjoy what I have to say, if enjoy is quite the word. We have to get into some screen sharing here, and I'll bring that up. There we go. So, as Remy has suggested, climate change is a huge problem, and I agree, of course, that it is, but it is not the problem confronting the human species. So the question I'm posing for us is, if climate change isn't the problem, what exactly is? And whoops, I don't know how that happened. Sorry, Remy, we seem to have some technical difficulties here. I'll try to go back. For goodness sake.
The tornado disrupted the...
Well, I've never had this problem before, so I'm going to have to belt out of it. There we go. Is that visible to everyone?
It is to me, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so climate change is real. It's happening. And all I've done here is list some of the indicators from this most recent year that tells us the nature of this problem. And of course, it's important to understand that all of these things together represent individual symptoms of a symptom. So climate change is happening. There are many symptoms such as these here listed. And the question we have to confront in the next few years, perhaps the next decade, is whether we have passed or are approaching an irreversible tipping point toward hothouse Earth. The main problem, however, is not that of climate change. It's the thing that we've investigated most thoroughly using our ecological footprint tool. I'm going to argue that climate change is simply one symptom of many of a phenomenon called ecological overshoot. Overshoot exists when the human enterprise is consuming more of the goods and services of natural systems than those systems can regenerate. We're also exceeding the assimilative capacity of the ecosphere. If you take that last point, for example, climate change becomes a waste management problem, because anthropogenic climate change caused by human activity is driven by carbon dioxide emissions. And carbon dioxide is the single largest waste product of industrial processes in all of the industrial countries on Earth. So climate change is symptomatic of overshoot, and in this case, overshooting the capacity of the ecosphere to assimilate the excess carbon being produced by the industrial activities of humankind. But in addition, we see the oceans acidifying, freshwaters toxifying, eroding soils, and so on and so on. And it's not just a biophysical problem, because accompanying all of these major biophysical changes is a widening economic crisis on the planet. Income gaps are widening. The poor are getting poorer in many countries, including even rich ones, such as the United States, even as global wealth increases at 2 or 3% per year. If we look at this strictly in terms of ecological footprint analysis, we can show that on the planet Earth today, there are only about 12 billion hectares of adequately productive ecosystems to sustain any kind of human activity. That's 12 billion hectares divided among a population of over 7.8 billion people now. So it comes down to about 1.6 global average hectares per capita. That's all that is really available and what we could use on a sustainable basis. But with current growth and current overpopulation, the human ecological footprint is approaching 20.9 billion hectares or 2.8 gigahectares or average hectares per capita. So we are in a situation of being 73% in overshoot. In other words, we are acting as if the planet were 73% larger than it actually is. And so when I talk even to school children, the obvious question is, well, how can we be using more planet than we've got? And I have to remind us that when we talk about overshoot, it's recognition that each year the planet is capable of producing a certain quantity of material and assimilating a certain quantity of waste. If we use all of that, then we're fine. But if we start using more than that, then we are drawing down the natural capital. So overshoot implies overfishing, soils erosion, destruction of tropical forests, the depletion of biomass, and so on and so forth. So we are actually depleting the very planet upon which we are utterly dependent for our goods and services from nature. We're consuming, dissipating, and displacing other species from their niches. And one of the most important elements of this, and I think it's showing up now in our growing income gap, that on a shrinking planet with a growing population, we're entering a situation where everyone is competing more intensely with everyone else for the shrinking biocapacity of the Earth. Well, how did a so-called intelligent species wind up in this situation? And I would argue there are two factors here. Generally speaking, humans only think of one at a time, but we've got two major factors. One is our base human nature. Human beings are genetically predisposed, like all other species, to expand to fill all accessible habitat and to use up all resources to which we have access. And in the case of humans, our availability, the availability of resources is constantly being redefined by technology. So we have this illusion that because of technological progress, we're constantly increasing the carrying capacity of Earth. So these are completely natural characteristics with enormous survival value, and we share them with all other species. So this is a very interesting story of many of monkeys and that have learned to use tools to open clams, and they're in their own habitat, driving local shellfish to extinction because people and other animals will use all the resources to which they have access. And in the case of even tool-wielding monkeys, having technology increases the capacity to access vital resources. The second causal factor is nurture. So we have human nature and creative nurture, the social learning, the cultural basis, also propelling us down this destructive path. Now, the problem here is, and many people aren't even consciously aware of this, is that human beings socially construct their realities. And by that I mean that we construct conceptual lenses. Think of political ideologies, religious doctrines, even scientific theories through which we perceive nature. So these conceptual lenses, once they're developed, determine the kind of reality that we perceive, so that people from very different cultural backgrounds perceive the real world in a very different way. And the problem is precisely that people live out of the constructed realities, the socially agreed nature of realities, as if this was the real thing. So again, to reiterate, we have a human nature that predisposes us to expand and to use up all available resources. And we create a sense of reality through our social dialogue. And it's from that sense of reality that we live. Now, at present, we have a global social construct called neoliberal economics. It's the economic basis for virtually all techno-industrial societies. Even some of the communist nations are moving in this direction. And neoliberal economics champions a perfect market, and where the marketplace becomes the arbiter of social value and so on and so forth. But most importantly, neoliberal economics has as its underpinning the notion that economic growth, material economic growth, is unlimited, and it is propelled by boundless technological progress. So under this assumption, human ingenuity, the inventiveness of the human mind, is really our most important resource. Professor Julian Simon, the late Professor Julian Simon of Maryland State University. Now, I guess the University of Maryland was one of the most vocal proponents of this. And here's a typical quote from his work. "We have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years." Well, anybody who understands anything about exponential growth realizes that this is an incredibly naive, intellectually challenged statement, but it's the kind of thing people like to hear, because if you believe profoundly in that particular social construct, then there's clearly no problem. We can feed, clothe, and supply energy for a period almost twice as long as the planet has been here. Now, when you combine these two things, our predisposition, genetically imposed and with enormous sort of survival value to expand, if we combine that with a modernist social construct such as neoliberal economics, the result is a mind-blowing rate of geometric growth of the human enterprise. So put it this way, it took human beings in our present form have been around for roughly somewhere between 250 and 350,000 years. And for all of that period of time, population hardly grew at all. It took all of that time to reach 1 billion people in the early part of the 19th century. But in just the last 200 years, that is to say 1/1700th as much time, we expanded from 1 billion to 7.8 billion in 2020. That's an astonishing reality. Meanwhile, gross world product, the output of the economy in real terms, increased by 100-fold. Per capita incomes on average increased by a factor of 13, and that goes up to 25 or 30 in rich countries. So our consumption has increased vastly faster than our population, which has obviously increased fast enough, but Earth didn't get any larger. So if we look at it this way, we get some idea of how remarkable this situation really is. The x-axis could be extended virtually indefinitely to the left, that 350,000 years. This is only 10,000 years of history, and you can see it's just the last 200 years that stand out as remarkable. But the idea here is that only 10 generations of people out of the thousands of generations of humans that have lived on this planet have experienced sufficient growth to notice it in their lifetime. So we take this to be the norm because you and I and our parents and our grandparents experienced it. So why wouldn't we think of it to be normal? But in fact, this period of 200 years of growth is the single most abnormal or anomalous period in human history. So that's the first thing to take from this graphic. The second is recognition that it was made entirely possible by fossil fuels. Certainly modern medicine increased longevity and reduced mortality and so on and so forth. But in the absence of fossil fuel, it couldn't have happened, because fossil fuel is the means by which we produce all our food and the other resources needed to create the infrastructure for human society. So we have then two things from this very simple graphic: an extraordinary expansion of the human enterprise in just 200 years, driven by a single resource of fossil fuel. Lots of other things are in play, obviously, but those are key points to take from this particular graphic. And just to underscore the importance of fossil fuel, here's a series of graphs put together by a colleague of mine. He shows population growth, per capita consumption of various forms of fuel, and then the total consumption. And of course, the graphs are virtually the same, except that energy consumption has actually increased even faster than has population growth. Now, here's a graphic that many people just find mind-boggling, but it's typical of what we learn from exponential growth. This is the increase in just fossil fuel use over the past couple of hundred years, a little less than that. But the bottom line is that 90% of all the fossil fuels ever consumed by human beings have been consumed since my lifetime, since 1943. 1/2 of all the fossil fuels ever consumed on Earth have been consumed in just the past 30 years. So one shouldn't wonder any longer, since all of these fossil fuels are emitting carbon dioxide, why we're seeing such an accelerated pace of climate change. But again, the important thing to keep in mind here is that with exponential growth, where you have a constant doubling time, the amount of resources consumed in any doubling time is equivalent to greater than the sum of all the resources consumed in all previous doubling periods. So 50% of all the fossil fuels ever consumed since the beginning of time have been consumed in just the past 30 years, in the lifetimes of most of us, which is absolutely an astonishing recognition once it sinks in. But it's not the only thing. Every other thing that humans are associated with in terms of consumption have escalated pretty much along the same lines, even faster than population growth. Because again, fossil fuel makes possible the development of new technologies, new mining techniques, new ways of accessing resources, new products, new techniques for building, and so on and so forth. And hence we see a continuous parade of exponential growth in just about everything. Now, another really important point to take into account here is that we keep being told by technological optimists that improvements in the efficiency of resource use will result in reduced impact. That's clearly not the case. All of this enormous growth that we're seeing here has taken place during a period of unprecedented increases in technological and economic efficiency. And the real impact of technology and economic efficiency gains is to lower prices, increase salaries and wages so that there's more money chasing cheaper goods and services, so consumption explodes. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So the problem is, of course, that the neoliberal economic paradigm as a social construct, a product of mind, contains no useful information at all about the ecological systems or the social systems within which the economy is embedded. In fact, neoliberal economics starts from the assumption that the economic system is separate from and independent of the ecosphere. And that's an absurd situation because the whole of the human enterprise is clearly a contained and wholly dependent subsystem of the ecosphere. So we're operating from an economic system that has no fundamental overlap with the systems that it is now largely in control of. I've said that it's rather like trying to guide the planet using a 1955 Volkswagen Beetle driver's manual, clearly an inadequate set of instructions. So this is one of the major symptoms of this complete disconnect between our economic paradigm and the ecosphere is, of course, the increasing symptoms of overshoot. And the best known one, of course, is the subject of your conference, climate change. What we see here is the continuous uptick in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. It's a sawtooth pattern because the instrumentation is so infinitely accurate that it can detect the seasonal cycle in the Northern Hemisphere. These data are from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Nevertheless, the uptick is the period of winter during which North American vegetation is largely dormant and hence it's not assimilating carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide rises rapidly in the atmosphere. The downtick occurs in the North American summers when vegetation is active in assimilating carbon dioxide. But each year, the uptick is slightly longer than the downtick. And so the general direction of the curve is upward. And you can see it's rising actually at an accelerating rate, an exponential rate. And we're already 45% above the pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We are literally changing the chemistry of the entire global system. Global surface temperatures clearly reflect this as well. And we were talking earlier about the increase of 1.7 degrees in mean average temperature in Israel. That's a little higher than the world average, but this is the trend over that period of time that we were looking at. And you can see that it's a fairly steady upward trend. 2020, the year just completed, is now tied with 2016 as the warmest year in the instrumental record. And the past 7 years are the 7 warmest years in the instrumental record. So there seems to be very little dispute anymore about the trends that we're beginning to experience here. But again, my emphasis is on the other non-climate symptoms of the same problem of overshoot. And I think this is a particularly important one that we have generally tended to ignore. If we go back 10,000 years to the dawn of agriculture, the beginning of the Neolithic age, human beings constituted, by our best estimates, far less than 1% of the total biomass of vertebrates on planet. So of all vertebrate animals, humans constituted 1%. Wild animals constituted 99%. 10,000 years later, 10,000 years of increasing productivity, most of which I have to say has happened in the last 200 years, we've seen an enormous increase in the total biomass, the weight of vertebrates on the planet, perhaps by as much as 7-fold. But of that 7-fold, humans now constitute 32%. The weight of human beings is 32% of the total weight of biomass, the total biomass of vertebrate animals on the planet. Wild animals have been reduced to about somewhere between 5 and 1%, because the other 67% is our livestock. Think about that. Human beings plus our livestock now constitute somewhere between 95 and 99% of the biomass of animal life on the planet, of vertebrate animal life on the planet. That's an amazing change, particularly in the last 200 years. But it's not just mammals. Wild bird populations are tumbling. Domestic poultry are now 70% of the world's bird biomass. Populations of all the monitored species that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the World Wildlife Fund, monitor are down by about 68 to 70% in just 50 years or so. Again, an amazing rate of what I call competitive displacement. I must emphasize that humans are just like other animals, just like other species. We share the same ecological productivity with all of these other species, but we're better at it. We're better at appropriating the products of nature than are other species because of our use of technology, of fossil fuel. And for that reason, we are competitively displacing other organisms from the ecosystems with which we share them. Even invertebrates, the insects and so on, are in decline, including essential pollinators. Butterflies, beetles, and bumblebees are all down by about 50%. Now, it's very, very important for us to recognize, first of all, as I've emphasized, that we don't, as a species, experience reality directly. We filter it through our social constructs. The problem is these social constructs don't necessarily map, they don't necessarily overlap with the reality they purport to represent. So we have a terribly dangerous situation right here in which we have politicians around the world, including Israel, by the way, who are under the illusion that there's no conflict between the growth of the human enterprise and the protection and conservation of the environment. My own prime minister is repeatedly saying that we can move forward with our oil and gas development and so on and so forth, our mining, because we can do this safely and cleanly. And again, there's no conflict between the growth of the Canadian economy and conservation of the environment. This is utter and absolute nonsense. The continuous growth of the human enterprise on a finite planet where we are sharing with all other species the products and goods of nature necessarily means the displacement of non-human species. So what this means is that every major leap forward in the scale, the scope of the human enterprise, the accumulation of capital, and so on, means a diminution of the rest of nature. Modern humans are systematically destroying the biophysical basis of their own existence. Now, how does the mainstream respond to that? One of the problems with a socially constructed reality is that it becomes a self-referencing system. Self-reference simply means that it comes back to itself in order to solve problems that it creates. So that if we look at modern technology and modern ideology, over the past 50 years, we've seen a shift away from the obvious approach to population problem, which is to begin to implement some form of population planning. That's what we talked about in the 1960s and 70s. It has now become the least researched approach to controlling human numbers. Instead, current literature shows us, and this is a quote, we find a strong and increasing focus on feeding the world through increasing food production via technology. So forget about population, no problem. We can use technology to feed the planet, okay? Agriculture is the single most damaging technology ever developed by human beings, particularly fossil fuel agriculture. We haven't got time to get into that, but it's a clearly demonstrable assertion. The other example is that in order to avoid potentially catastrophic climate change, and by the way, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change shows that we need to reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide by 50% by 2030, and we need to have complete decarbonization by 2050. But the politically acceptable solutions include only those capital intensive investments, such as wind turbines, solar power, and so on, that will maintain the existing growth-based economic order. So the idea is, again, to use technology to displace fossil fuel with an energetically equivalent energy base to maintain the growth technology, so that there's no serious consideration in mainstream circles. How many governments talk about conservation, demand reduction, lifestyle changes, more equitable distribution, and so on and so forth? They're simply not on the table. And as a very good colleague of mine, and actually took a class from me many, many years ago, Clive Spash has written that disaster policy is being designed to serve the capitalist growth-based economy. So the latter appears to be the solution and not the cause of the problem. So this is a direct result of that self-reference. Technology caused the problem, so how do we solve it? More technology. Let's pile more of the same on, and not discuss any of the things that might actually solve the problem. Well, let's take a look at that. Again, we're touching on, it's like a stone skipping over the surface of a pond, just looking at little insights. But here's another insight. We have an orientation in the planet toward continuous growth. The human economy is tightly associated with increases in energy growth. So as the economy grows, so does the total requirements for energy. So in the most recent year for which we have data, 2018 and 19, the increase in primary energy consumption was 7.67 exajoules. So that's a small increase, by the way. It's been much faster than that in recent years, of only 1.3%. The increase in non-hydro renewables, the wind and solar and so on, was massive. It went up by 12%. But because it's starting from such a small base, the increase in absolute terms is only 3.15 exajoules, which is less than 1/2 of the increase in global energy demand. And if we look at electricity, that's the second side here on the right, where most of the progress is being made in renewable energy, the total increase was 352 terawatt hours, which is only 1.3% of world electricity demand, again, a low figure for that year. But the increase in electricity generation by non-hydro renewables was only 337 terawatt hours. So what we see is every year that the growth in demand exceeds the increments provided by the growing implementation of renewables. And as long as growth exceeds the rate at which we can replace them with renewables, we can't get ahead. So the bottom line is that we're still 84% dependent on fossil fuels, 84% dependent on fossil fuels. This at a time when we're supposed to be decoupling the economy from fossil fuels, which, by the way, is an impossible exercise. So it looks like this. We are willing to go to any extent to save the economy at the expense of the environment. And I think editorial cartoonists, I mean, I've been speaking for 20 minutes here, and I haven't said as much as a single cartoon says about the nature of our current mindset. We've socially constructed a situation in which the economy is everything, the ecosphere is nothing. So as matters stand, and here I become a biologist again, if you look at the recent expansion of the human enterprise, it resembles to me more than anything else, and I don't think anyone else has really picked up on this, the plague phase of a one-off boom-bust population cycle. This is a diagram from a standard textbook in biology, Life on Earth, and it describes what happens when a species comes into a new environment where there are plentiful resources and not much negative feedback holding it down. Those conditions favor growth. There's an exponential boom in the population, but that results very quickly, not very quickly necessarily, but inevitably in a bust phase because nutrients are depleted or pollution becomes extreme and the population crashes. So keep in mind that humans are just on this uptick and we're somewhere near the top now. The question is, are we going to bust like this and crash? Okay, well, all sorts of other species do. This is a classic study of what happens when reindeer were introduced to 2 islands off the coast of Alaska, the Pribilofs, and in between the wars. We see an enormous increase in these populations, explosive exponential growth. By the way, the curve for the St. Paul's Island population is identical again to that of human population growth in the last couple of 100 years. But as soon as the lichens upon which the reindeer feed were depleted, the populations crashed. A smaller island with less resources, same result on a different time frame. So we have a situation in which the human population explosion resembles exactly what happens when other species in their plague phase in nature expand beyond the capacity of their ecosystems to sustain them. A collapse is inevitable. Okay, so we don't necessarily have to follow that route because although we are similar to other species in ecological characteristics, we should be able to avoid an uncontrolled collapse and instead engineer a controlled contraction, so to speak, because we have high intelligence, the capacity for logical analysis, the ability to reason from the evidence. And look at all the evidence we've seen just in this short presentation. We have an absolutely unique ability to plan ahead. No other species is capable of assessing the current situation, looking at the data and deciding how the future should unfold. We also should be able to exercise moral judgment and empathy and compassion for other people and other species. So putting these uniquely human qualities together, we should be able to solve this problem. But it turns out that humans, although we have these capacities, they don't much interfere with the way we govern our affairs. And we've known this for a very long time. You can download a book called The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind by Gustave Le Bon from the 19th century. And here's just one of many pithy quotes from it. The masses have never thirsted after truth. We don't pay attention to the evidence. They turn aside from the evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduces them. So we're seduced by these visions of an unlimited plenty in the future. Whoever supplies them with the illusions is easily a master. We are master illusionists. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. Okay, we throw stones at the messengers of bad news. Barbara Tuchman, a Pulitzer Prize winning American historian, wrote a wonderful book called The March of Folly in 1984, in which she claims wooden-headedness plays a remarkably large role in government. It consists in assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions, that's our economic ideology, while ignoring any contrary signs. It is acting according to wish, while not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts. I direct you to the former Trump government in the United States as an exemplar of precisely that situation. And here's how it plays out. This again is the uptick in the global atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And we've shown here all of the major agreements to control this phenomenon. that have taken place. In addition, I've put in the limits to growth, the amazing volume published back in 1972 that predict exactly the situation we're headed to. The scientists' warning to humanity from 1992 that said this is a completely unsustainable track. But the point is that this consistent destruction of the environment over 50 years has seen 34 climate conferences, half a dozen major international agreements, and various scientific warnings, but they've had no effect whatsoever. They don't produce a dimple on this curve of rising carbon dioxide levels. The limits to growth, the volume I mentioned earlier, published in 1972, received a great deal of press, but was quickly suppressed, particularly by economists who said, don't believe that. The economy is self-fixing, using market forces, human ingenuity will solve all our problems. There are no limits. Well, it turns out we've seen now 3 separate studies that plot the actual world according to real data since the publication of limits to growth, and the real world is actually tracking the standard run. So to the extent that the real world are the purple lines, the green lines are the standard run of the limits to growth model, and you can see that the real world is a pretty good replica so far of what happened in limits to growth, and we, if that continues, we'll be confronting major systemic crashes in the next 40 to 50 years. Now, we actually have an explanatory cognitive mechanism now. It turns out, and keep in mind the social construction of reality, during the individual development, the development of each of us within a particular context, repeated exposure to sensory experiences and cultural norms literally help shape the synaptic circuits of our brain, so that we think of habitual thought patterns. That's where they come from. And once these synaptic circuits are in place, a particular way of thinking that you've learned over a 20 or 30 year period, people subsequently seek out compatible experience. We seek out compatible people to speak to and communicate with. And when faced with information that does not agree with our preformed internal structures, the structures in our brains put there by our social constructs, we tend to deny, discredit, reinterpret, or forget that information. And if you want to catch up on the recent thinking in this, look for Bruce Wexler's little book, Brain and Culture. Here's a very simple cartoon again that puts it more simply. A wonderful encapsulation of Wexler's thesis and many others. It's not Wexler, of course. The problem with your reasoned solutions is that they don't fit my preconceived notions of the problem. So here we have a typical politician responding to the science, and it's just not going to work. Things are actually worse than that, because in the last 50 years or so, since the rise of neoliberal economic thinking, among other things, we in effect as a society have been socially engineered. There's been a purposeful redefinition of the dialogue around economics and development. In other words, a purposeful construction of a social construct that ignores reality. So that politics is increasingly influenced by neoliberal ideology, and in some countries, including the United States, religious fundamentalism. We see we're knee-deep in climate change denial, anti-intellectualism, and other forms of what I call magical thinking. It's so bad that in 2016, the Oxford Dictionaries, which always picks a word of the year, what is the word that captures best the flavor of the year? In 1916, it was post-truth. Well, we're in a post-truth era. And post-truth is defined as anything relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts, the science we're talking about, are less influential in shaping public opinion than our appeals to emotion and personal belief. So humans are not rational. We respond more to that which we love, that which we like, that to which we are emotionally connected, and that which we believe. We believe something in the face of the evidence to the contrary. So this has become, in many respects, a new age of unreason, of science denial and magical thinking. I call this the endarkenment, okay? So here's the big thing we refuse to acknowledge, that to act consistently with our best science, including our climate science, may well require a planned economic and population contraction. The question is, can humanity learn to live more equitably within the means of nature before we are forced to do so by nature itself? Okay, so this is the curve that needs flattening. During the pandemic, we hear over and over again of the need, at least we do in North America, of the need to flatten the curve. And the curve they're referring to, of course, is the massive growth in the cases of COVID-19 that's occurring in many parts of the world. Well, think of human beings as being just like COVID-19. That's a viral species capable of geometric or exponential growth. So are human beings. This is the human exponential growth curve. We're in a state of overshoot, where we have exceeded the long-term carrying capacity of the planet. One result of that is that we're consuming the biophysical basis of our own existence. And that means there's less opportunity for the future. The carrying capacity of Earth is in steady decline as the fish stocks, the soils are depleted, and so on, as the oceans and the atmosphere are polluted. What we need to do is bend that curve along this green line so that we learn to live well within the carrying capacity of the planet and not risk the enormous loss of carrying capacity, which would result in a far smaller human population in the future. So this would extend the potential lifetime of civilization. If we allow this to continue, there will be a violent crash, and it won't be pleasant for anyone. So if I can just summarize and put the choice before us, climate change is indeed a serious problem. We must deal with it, but it's a mere symptom of a much greater disease, which is the generalized overshoot of the human population above and beyond the long-term carrying capacity of Earth. We cannot solve any of these problems in isolation, and doing so would be futile because the others would take us down. They are a collective issue under the umbrella of overshoot. Well, we are in that critical overshoot, and the present trajectory resembles a plague phase of a one-off population cycle, and if it is not corrected deliberately, it will crash. We may or may not already be on some critical tipping point, not only in climate, but in other ways as well. So in my view, in coming years, there's no question that the human enterprise will contract. But as an intelligent, planning-capable moral species, we can theoretically make a choice between insistence on business as usual, which risks, in my view, a chaotic implosion imposed by nature, followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars, or we can come together as a society, realize the flaws in our currently globally shared, constructed vision of reality, accept what our science is telling us, and in that context, cooperate internationally toward a well-planned, orderly, and cooperative descent toward a socially just sustainability for all. So human beings must learn, if we wish civilization to continue, to live much more equitably, well within the biophysical carrying capacity, well within the means of nature. Thank you very much.
Yep.
There we go.
So much.
You don't have to do that.
I feel speechless, to say the truth. Yeah, I think, obviously I'm convinced. I think that you kind of encircled the problem and also the way forward, which looks quite vague and distant right now, quite clearly. I have several questions, but I would like to give the audience opportunity first to ask. So let's see. Okay, so one question is how do we force people to confront reality? Are there any grounds for optimism? Good question. I will ask another one already. Since the current civilization is a result of fossil fuels, produced in the Carboniferous era, where atmospheric CO2 concentration were 8 times higher than today, is not our current use of fossil fuels and production of CO2 simply our role in recycling CO2 in geological time, and we can hail another carbon intensive period in the future million years. Okay, I hope you understood it, because for me it was a bit too much. Okay, please go on.
Okay, first of all, are there grounds for optimism? Well, I ask you, human beings are uniquely endowed with the capacity to understand our circumstance. Every other species, even advanced mammals, simply takes life as it comes. We are in a totally different circumstance where we can assess the situation and choose to act accordingly. Look, we've acted completely naturally in our efforts to grow. That's a natural tendency. And so long as there was no pushback from the environment, we would continue that. Why wouldn't we? Any species would. But we're now getting that kind of pushback. So it is time for a major reassessment. So as I said, I've tried to emphasize that we have this capacity to reason from the evidence and to act logically in planning for a better future, given the nature of the future that is obviously unfolding around us. With a 2-degree increase in mean global temperature, Israel will become uninhabitable. And that's where we're headed. Many other places on the planet are similarly going to be in circumstances where they simply become uninhabitable. There will be massive migrations of people, resulting in all sorts of geopolitical conflict. We can see that coming. It's already starting. So we can, as an intelligent species with the capacity to reflect on reality and to challenge ourselves to rise to this full potential, to move forward. That's my only hope. Unfortunately, it may take some kind of micro catastrophe to wake enough people up to the fact that they themselves are threatened. See, another of our socially constructed myths is that our technology and our wealth protect us from the worst consequences of this. So in North America, we're being told, oh yeah, climate change may be happening, but it's happening over there to other people. And that appeals to another natural, I suppose, instinct of humans. We are natural discounters. Human beings prefer the here and now and close relatives and friends to any distant place, total strangers, and merely possible future events. So even though science is telling us this is what the future is going to happen, we tend to displace that onto other people elsewhere, and hence we don't have to do very much over here. Now, again, we know that that's how we behave. And so we have to shake ourselves to realize that we are self-delusionists. It had remarkably high survival value 10,000 years ago, but in rapidly changing circumstances such as today, it becomes maladaptive. We need to wake up to the nature of our own reality. We need to discard our socially constructed belief set. We need to develop a new set of beliefs, values, and assumptions about the nature of the reality in which we are actually embedded, and move forward accordingly. Now, we have the capacity to do that. The question I put to you is whether you think you see it happening anywhere. The second question is, well, aren't we just, the climate on Earth has gone through huge changes before. Fossil fuels are just, recycling natural carbon and all the rest of it. Look, more has changed in the Earth's climate in the last 100 years. More has changed in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide in the last couple of 100 years than in any previous time in history. Yes, it's true that if you go back, I can't remember the names of there were periods of much warmer Earth, much cooler Earth, and so on and so forth. But these shifts took place over tens of thousands of years, or hundreds of years at least. We're doing it in a remarkably short period of time. Secondly, we have lived during a period of history, of geological time, which has been remarkably stable. Just say the post-glacial period, the Pleistocene, is a remarkably stable period of climate to which our entire system has adapted. So we are adapted to the kinds of circumstances, the global temperature range, rainfall patterns, climate patterns that have existed in the past several thousand years. A dramatic shift away from that will put us into circumstances to which we are maladapted. Imagine a world 2 or 3 degrees warmer. It becomes, as I say, uninhabitable for many millions of people, because the places in which they have become adapted no longer are suitable for human existence. They may be no different from circumstances that existed 10,000 or rather 100,000 or 300,000 years ago, but they're not the circumstances to which our current society has adjusted. So we are inducing changes to the ecosphere at a much more rapid rate than nature does, and we are doing so in ways that put our own circumstances in jeopardy. So it's not just a readjustment along nature's way. Other questions?
Thank you. We have a very good but quite long question from Dr. Yosef Gottlieb. Maybe you'd like to ask it yourself? But you will need to unmute for that. Okay, so I can do that. Okay, so do you believe it is possible to restrain the momentum of the collective production, consumption, reproduction processes already underway? And what is the role of social, this is, I think, another question which is, of course, relevant and important for us. What is the role of social scientists and humanities in affecting the transformation?
Well, first of all, this is the critical question of the day. You see, we're dealing with a world of multiple cultures and perceptions and ways of viewing reality. And that's actually getting more and more complex, because with social media, we're seeing increasing, I suppose, diversity of views and opinions. Every major group that has a completely idiotic view of the world can create its own little bubble and gather acolytes and so on and so forth. So in some sense, we're seeing a period where there's a breakdown of any sense of common purpose among human beings. And I think this is a very dangerous trend that is going to be making things much more difficult to overcome. I should back up a bit. I think we know what needs to be done. So the what is not a difficult issue. The how is a difficult question, and that's really what you're asking. In order for us to move forward on this, we need some kind of global agreement as to the nature of the problem. Now, where social science can come into it is to help us understand how it is that society moves forward. What are our models of social learning that enable whole cultures to shift their direction, to shift their views, to change their basic beliefs, values, and assumptions? I can't answer that question. I'm a non-social scientist. My instinct is the following, that what we're engaged in today is a process of social learning. Social learning is the reconstruction of these neural pathways. It's the recreation of a new way of looking at reality. As I say, we do have these social constructs. Our present ones are antiquated. We need new ones. This means a shift in our beliefs, values, and assumptions about our role in nature. That's a huge problem about our place in the world. Okay, how we do it is the job for social scientists, I suppose. What was the second part of this question? I forget.
Yeah, maybe this is something that you already addressed. So I move to another question about the COVID. So first, generally, by Maya, what are the opportunities and barriers presented by the COVID crisis?
Well, one thing I think.
Just a second, just another question about COVID. So even in the COVID crisis, where we see the impacts of and we can measure them, people still deny it or don't agree how to act. How do we expect them to act for a future remote problem? Okay, I think that this is,
well, again, you're underscoring some of the problems that I touched on. COVID, I think, is a tremendously interesting phenomenon because it does two things. Again, it shows how people who have different constructs or perceptions of reality respond very differently to an obvious crisis. There are those who are in complete denial that it's a problem, even today, which to me is absolutely remarkable given the nature of the evidence to the contrary. But what COVID has also shown is the remarkable speed with which, when confronted with a crisis, governments can act should they choose to do so. You know, it's really interesting that there are numerous problems we confront, but governments say, oh no, we can't deal with that because of the impact on the economy. Oh no, we can't deal with that because it would upset the fiscal policy. Oh, we can't do that because, et cetera, et cetera. But COVID comes along and suddenly governments all over the world are using quantitative easing, basically printing money. In Canada, anybody who has been economically affected by this disease will receive $2,000 a month in federal subsidies. We're spending literally billions of dollars, which apparently didn't exist before, to ease the economic impact of the COVID crisis. We're seeing an immense increase in the government subsidies to businesses of all kinds, again, to keep the economy afloat. We're seeing all kinds of discussion now about the need for tax reform so that there's a more equitable distribution of income within the country. None of those movements would have been possible prior to the COVID crisis. Now, COVID, you see, in many respects, it's a warning, it's a wake-up call, because it's a trivial problem compared to the kinds of problems that are coming at us right now. COVID may kill 2 or 3 million people, and that's a terrible thing. But this year, the population on Earth will increase by 80 or 84 million people. So even though COVID seems like a major disaster, it doesn't even affect the trajectory of human population growth significantly. So if we can respond that well and that rapidly to a relatively trivial crisis, surely to goodness, once it sinks in that we are on this trajectory for a major global implosion, then certainly governments can muster both the popular support, even though there will be enclaves of people who don't believe that this is happening, surely we can move forward. By the way, I believe that if one major international government, supposing we had a really charismatic president of the United States or the United Kingdom or even Russia, get up and say to the world community, we have made a grave error, that this whole approach that we've been taking around growth and accumulation of wealth at the 1% and so on is a self-destructive trajectory. We are going to take the lead to move us forward in a different direction. That might have a catalytic effect in waking people up to the nature of the reality in which we find ourselves as a species. But I don't see that happening yet. One way it might happen is if sufficient numbers of people become convinced that they themselves will be confronting a problem and start marching in the streets. Governments respond to major crises, and that's what COVID has shown us. COVID has shown us that they can respond with remarkable alacrity in shifting all sorts of parameters that previously seemed unmovable. But once we get thousands or millions of people marching in the street demanding action on climate change, demanding action on biodiversity loss, demanding action on regulating our population in some way, they'll have to respond. You see, we haven't gotten into this, but right now it's quite evident that most national governments have almost been captured by the corporate sector. One of the things that has accompanied the rise of neoliberal economics is the power of the corporate sector. And I'll use the United States as an example. It's an adjacent country, one that I'm familiar with. But there's been a huge increase in recent decades of what is called agency capture, where the individuals who are running regulatory agencies are the former executives of the national firms or the international conglomerates that those regulatory agencies are set up to regulate. And so there's been almost a direct exchange of personnel. It's called the revolving door syndrome between regulators and regulatees, so that the deregulation has become rife. We've seen a massive change in the tax system in favor of the corporate sector and against the population in general. So we've seen this capture of governments by corporate sector. We need to recapture government for the common good. If anything, if I say anything at all, we are confronting a problem which is a problem of the collective. Some people cringe at the sound of that word. Unsustainability is a collective problem. It faces each of us, but each of us can't solve it as individuals. Another manifestation of the neoliberal paradigm is that it has offloaded responsibility onto the individual. You have to consume less. You have to leave your car at home. You have to take better transit. You have to do that, et cetera, shower with a friend, all of the trivial little silly things that people come up with so that they can individually serve. But the point is, we've shown in various publications that if individuals did everything they could, it wouldn't make much difference, because the heavy lifting is a collective responsibility. If we want to have appropriate tax reform, that must be implemented by governments on behalf of the common good. I, as an individual, can't implement the carbon taxes. I, as an individual, can't create the public transit systems. I, as an individual, can't divert investment toward more sustainable forms of energy production, and so on and so forth. So we have spent 50 years dissolving the concept of a common good and inflating the power of the individual. And it's a completely opposite direction to that which we must be taking here. We need to recapture the political process so that the major actions of government are taken on behalf of the population, the common good, the collective, if you will, rather than on behalf of narrow interests. And the COVID exercise, this is a long answer to that question, shows us that this can be done, because that's precisely what we've seen happen in many jurisdictions, including Israel, which has, among other things, one of the world's most successful vaccination programs.
Thank you so much. Two more questions from the audience. Dotan Halevi asks, he wonders, if you are not applying, so when you're applying the biological boom and bust analogy to humanity's lifespan, aren't you forcing the self-adjusting market economy mythology, which you argue against, onto nature? Will nature fix itself by this massive extinction? Okay, so this is the first question. And the second, and also many thanks for this wonderful lecture. And the second, is there any research of how millennials and the young generations could potentially lead a change, as they have been socially educated in a much more environmentally aware societies? This is a question by Ori Ofek, and it also connects to the previous question by Omer Elam about the potential role of the new, so there is a new awakening in civil society, Greta Thunberg, and Extinction Rebellion, and so on. So I guess these are, at least some of these questions should be addressed purely by social scientists and humanists, but please.
Okay. Yeah. So very interesting and difficult questions. Let's go back to the boom bust thing. Look, take a good look at my slides. As I said, they're available to all of you. Anyone who wants a copy, Rami can give those to you because he has a master copy there. There is no question. Do you really seriously believe that the human enterprise can continue to grow along the trajectory of the last 200 years? Keep in mind that with another doubling of the economy, I'm going to make 2 points. Right now, we are already about 72% in overshoot, okay? If we double the economy, if we double material consumption, and keep in mind, most of the anticipated growth will be among those populations that don't yet have sufficient material well-being. So it's entirely possible that with a doubling of global economic output, there can be a doubling of material and energy throughput. But that means that over the next 30 or 40 years, in the next doubling, as much material and energy will be used as in all of the previous doubling periods combined, going back to, say, 1800. And if we're already 73% in overshoot, this cannot happen without imploding major ecosystems and the climate system. So nature will impose a solution. That explosive growth can no more continue indefinitely in humans than it can in other species, which is why I can say with some confidence that it will come down. The only question before us is whether it will come down because of catastrophic changes in the systems that sustain us, including the climate, or whether we can wake up to this reality and engineer, both social engineering and other forms, a relatively soft landing. So that's my position on that. It's a matter of opinion, but I think it's strongly backed by the science, not only of our own species, but of other species. As for millennials and people who have a better sense of this kind of reality, that is a sign of hope. On the other hand, I grew up in the 60s and 70s during a period of the emergence of hippies, the back to the land movement, and all sorts of people who thought things would be very differently if they changed their perspectives. But they were marginal within society. And I think the millennials will suffer the same fate of being captive to the larger dynamic over time as they acquire families and a need for economic security and so on and so forth. And the machine simply takes on. I don't see any major shift in the value set among millennials that I know. Some of them may not want a car, but that's because they want to travel around the world, but that involves, fossil fuels as well. So let's hope that the millennials and those who are better informed create a different world, but they'll need a hell of a lot of help if that's going to happen. There's another important underlying bit of academic work here, and that is that I suppose those of us such as myself who are in the know around these issues, if we take a comparison of all the environmental sciences on the planet and compare their purchasing patterns, their lifestyles with other people who are completely ignorant of environmental issues, but at the same income level, we don't see a whole lot of difference. So the mere knowledge, the mere capacity to understand these situations doesn't necessarily mean that you behave any differently, because you need the social support of a culture in order to make significant changes in the way you live. I cannot, if I live in a city like Atlanta in the eastern United States, where it's so sprawled out and there's a poor transit system, I can't give up my car because there's no alternative, okay? And that's what people learn, that it's very difficult without a massive social shift or cultural wide shift to change a way of being and still be a part of the society in which you live. So again, let me emphasize, people who have a very solid understanding of our ecological problems don't necessarily behave a whole lot differently than people in same income groups who are much more ignorant of these circumstances. And it's because we don't have the social supports to move forward. I don't have a sustainable lifestyle. And I'm not about to go out and try to acquire one without the social support. It wouldn't even be possible without the cultural support to do that.
Thank you. Bill, there are more questions around flowing, and also ask the organizers. We have, and me personally, many more questions to ask you, but it's time to wrap up because we are committed to a certain time frame. Thank you so much for coming here virtually and informing us with this phenomenal range of insights, and also your passion to the which is truly inspiring, both for the interdisciplinary endeavor that we are trying to achieve, and also the activist spirit behind it. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure, and again, I feel almost sorry that we've had so little time. These are such hugely important issues to get into at depth, and I'd like to share so much more with you, but I hope we've had enough of at least a superficial look at some of these issues to make you curious enough to pursue them on your own, because I think we have some inordinate, unprecedented challenges ahead. I believe we can face them together and beat them, but if we all say, phooey, and hide in our own little bubbles of disbelief, then we have a very hard time ahead. So let's be optimistic, come together, let's solve this baby.
Thank you very much. Many people would like to thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for an important and fascinating talk and more. I think I speak in the name of everyone that we indeed learned a lot and we have a lot to digest, actually. So not too little information, but too much. So thank you so much, and it is really appreciated, and we will keep you informed.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye. Okay. So